أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. Welcome to our weekly show, The Struggle Within, a show that was born off the hadith that has come from the 6th Holy Imam, where he mentions the companions and the Prophet when they were returning from battle and they were congratulating one another on having performed the minor jihad. The Prophet said to them, prepare yourselves now for the greater jihad. And they asked the Prophet, what is this greater jihad? Having returned from battle, he said, the greater jihad is the jihad of the nafs, the struggle within. I'm delighted to be joined once again by Shaykh Ali Hussein Datu. Assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much once again for taking the time out. Following on from our previous shows, looking at some of the vices that we need to be aware of when we're embarking on this greater struggle or this struggle within, we're moving on now to something that we feel that is often seen in many corners, and that is the vice of pride. We'll begin the show with a hadith, again from the 6th Holy Imam, where one of his companions asked him, what is the lightest degree of apostasy? The Imam answered that pride is the lowest degree of apostasy, apostasy being having left the religion. So the lowest form of having fallen out of the boundaries of the religion or having left your faith is the idea of having pride. Shaykh, if we can begin the show maybe with some descriptions of pride in itself, and ultimately, are there various levels to this sin?
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Pride is a characteristic that is reserved for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. The reason being is that when you wish to be proud of something, you have to have completed it and accomplished it by yourself. So for example, if you've created something, you need to have created it independently of anything else in order to be totally proud of it. We know that this doesn't exist for us as mankind. Anything that we do, it's only because of the permission and the power of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And therefore the only existent that has the right to be proud, and hence he is termed and named himself Al-Mutakabbir, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's for this reason that we find these strong ahadith that talk about pride being equated to a level of apostasy or even a level of shirk. When we look at the categorizations of pride, we find there are three. The first being al-kibr, which is when somebody has a superiority complex or finds there's something superior in their actions, be it in their faith, that somebody thinks that they're pious, so they are superior to somebody else, or it can work to the opposite, that somebody has a lack of faith and they're actually pleased with that and feel that they've done something good. It could be that somebody has virtues or good actions, and on the opposite side it could be somebody who has vices and evil actions who are then proud of it. This is al-kibr. Then we have al-ujb, is where one exaggerates what they have done. So they've done a certain action, they've maybe fasted, they've given some charity, but they exaggerate this action. And finally it's ar-riya, which is showing off. All of these, as you may have noticed, are an action that an individual does in order to realize or obtain something from people. He or she wants people to praise. He or she wants people to applaud. He's looking or she's looking for something from people, which indicates to us that this individual has a vacuum within themselves or is very insecure with the actions that they've done, because they're not it's not sufficient for them to know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is pleased with them. There's no greater pleasure than Allah being pleased with you or me. But if this individual is still looking for the pleasure of people, it's showing that they've misunderstood and they haven't understood why they've acted in the way they have or completed the good deed which they've done.
You've mentioned various different elements within your introduction that we will touch on in more detail. The idea that people are often proud, or they look for that recognition from other people, or they boast for for, once again, that recognition. But ultimately, sometimes it could be the idea that they're so boastful of themselves, the idea that it's not even recognition from other people, it's recognition just for themselves. It's such a level of self-worship, you could say, that they're not bothered about what other people think. It's just that the fact that they're so proud, or they're so pleased with what they have done just for themselves, if that makes sense. We will expand on that further, but I want to take the discussion right to the beginning. What is the root cause of this? We mentioned the idea that, you know, pride is a characteristic that is solely owned by God, or solely for Him alone. So if an individual is to have this characteristic of pride, is it because ultimately they have misunderstood their own reality in the grand scheme of things, or the reality of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that sense? They haven't grasped how great He is, so that they can even consider that they are great, because there's no comparison, obviously. Or the idea that they haven't understood themselves, in that they aren't actually able to do anything independently. So there is a massive void or gap in an understanding either of God or of themselves.
I think it works that initially they have to understand God. And if they don't understand the greatness of God, then they won't understand how lowly a creature they are. When one misinterprets, doesn't understand the characteristics of God, and it's through His characteristics that we understand Him, then they realize that they too have a role to play, they too own something. There's a beautiful hadith of the sixth Imam with Unwan al-Basri, where he mentions that you don't own the wealth that you have, you're just simply a tool to give it away. When man understands that everything is owned by God, how great He is, then he can understand how low man is, how low he himself is, how he doesn't own anything. Then you'll find that nobody will want to share this characteristic with God. Why would somebody want to involve a third party into their worship with God? Why would they want to worship God in order for somebody else to be pleased with them or say praiseworthy words about them? When they realize how great God is, they see everything else as insignificant, including themselves and their own actions. Here, I think we should make a distinction, because it becomes quite blurry if we don't speak about self-confidence. That yes, we shouldn't be proud in the negative manner, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be confident in what we're doing. It's very easy for somebody to misjudge the two. And for example, if you go out for an interview at work, you don't sell yourself well. You don't talk about your skills and your accomplishments because you think you might be boasting. You might be showing pride, and this is against the edicts and the ethics of Islam. There's a big difference here. Speaking the truth, but doing it for a positive reason, doing it out of gratitude of what Allah has allowed you to accomplish, is very different to then having pride. When a parent sees that the child rides a bike for the first time, they might feel grateful within themselves to Allah. At the same time, they feel very proud of the child, but not in a negative manner. That pride is not that I am the one who taught this child how to do this without any input from God. Rather, it's a gratitude towards God that He's given me the ability and the power to teach this child this particular action. So there's a big difference between pride, the negative one, and the positive one, or the self-confidence that you and I have to have in order for us to continue living in this life.
I think, yes, definitely, it's a very, very valid point to make, but ultimately it comes back to this element that, you know, no matter how successful one is, no matter how intellectual one is, or how much wealth they have amassed, etc., etc., however you want to quantify it, if they have the understanding that it was not them or solely them that achieved this, that however they were able to achieve these things, you know, whatever it is, whether it's knowledge, attaining a degree or whatever it is, the fact that it has come from God. So even if that they are confident, if we want to use that word, or even if they have a sense of accomplishment, that they have achieved something, and they are glad about that achievement, or the fact that somebody is able to see that, okay, they have amassed large quantities of wealth through hard work, for example, and they can see that the fruits of their labor and the years of hard work and struggle have now reached somewhere where they are able to be influential people, powerful people. But ultimately it's coming back, it's that understanding or that ma'rifah that, hold on, however great I am, it's actually nothing in comparison. There's no, you can't even put them together in a sentence. And ultimately, whatever you achieved, it's through God. It's keeping that as a constant. So no matter how confident or how great or how much you've achieved, it's keeping that fundamental constant that this did not happen by itself or by my own will or intuition, in that sense. So is that why the Imam has mentioned apostasy, the idea that you have moved away from that understanding that everything is from God, to the point that you now feel or believe that you have accomplished something, or you individually have attained a certain characteristic or goal, for example?
Correct. We find a hadith that talk about how pride is related to apostasy and how it's related to polytheism. Apostasy, as you mentioned in the beginning, is to remove yourself from the faith. It's basically rejecting God. In order to reject God, you have to see yourself as something worthy and independent of Him. And that's why you're rejecting Him. That's exactly what happens when somebody has this form of pride, where they see themselves as the doer of the action, the one who's accomplished the action, the one who's sustaining himself and the action as well. And that is a low form of rejecting God, as the Imam says in the hadith as well. Hence, it's equated to apostasy. On the other hand, the other hadith talk about shirk and polytheism. It's when somebody does an action and their intention is to bring somebody else in with God. Like we mentioned about the prayer, that somebody's praying to God, but their intention is now mixed and polluted with the praise of somebody else as well. That's when the act of pride is now equated to polytheism. So it can be equated to both polytheism or apostasy, depending on how you look at the act of pride.
I want to move the discussion further. We'll come back to, for example, having pride in worship, for example. Things that are ultimately on the surface seen as positive, but through this pride you end up tainting the intention and tainting the actual action. But before we do that, I want to look at how pride in oneself or in one's achievements, or in, for example, pride in your background or your lineage, or these kind of things that we see so commonly. It could be a race issue, it could be the idea that you come from a certain background that is wealthy, for example. And then you have various, you look within the community or you in society, or you see people from a different background, different nations, different things, who have achieved far less. And what we end up doing is forgetting again the idea of that constant, that everything is from God. And ultimately what we end up doing is forming stereotypes, consciously, unconsciously. How dangerous is this, where we have, not necessarily with bad intention, but we form stereotypes that people from a certain background or a certain nation or a certain community are less achieving or less hardworking. And we form these stereotypes, and ultimately we then have pride within our own background, lineage, nation, etc.
I think it's very detrimental to build these stereotypes, and it can happen in one of two ways. Either the individual who you've come across has a certain characteristic that is not negative but is different to yours, for example a different race or a different nationality or lineage, or they can have a characteristic that is blameworthy. For example, if there's somebody who is a gambler, who is an alcoholic, they have characteristics which are blameworthy, and so you create a stereotype of them. As for the first, Islam came to remove all class systems. You find from Hajj to how we pray, even to the mu'adhin of Islam, the first mu'adhin, Bilal. You look at Imam Hussein in Karbala and how there was no distinguishing between who was going to the battlefield, black, white, Arab, non-Arab. They all sacrificed their lives for Imam al-Hussein, and their blood mixed with the blood of the Holy Family as well. When you come to those types of stereotypes that individuals create, that I am from a certain background or nationality and you're from a different one, you realize that again, individuals have not understood Islam and are not practicing the true Islam that the Ahlul Bayt left for you and I. If in Hajj we're commanded to strip of any type of class distinction, even to the extent that you shouldn't have any type of stitching in your ihram, to make sure that you don't show superiority against somebody else. When we're told to pray and move shoulder to shoulder, depending, it doesn't matter who's next to you. It could be the poor, it could be the rich, it could be the famous. It doesn't really matter. And Islam wants to teach us that that's exactly how Allah wants you to realize your reality. That in His eyes, you're not distinguished by your skin color, by your wealth, or your fame, or your popularity, or lineage. Hence the verse of Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, we've created you from nations and people, لِتَعَارَفُوا. We've created you man and woman of nations and people in order that you may know one another. That's the goal of these differences between us, number one. Number two, Allah says, إِنَّ أَكْرَمَكُمْ عِنْدَ اللَّهِ أَتْقَاكُمْ. You have these differences, but if you want to know who's closest to Allah, it's the one who is most noble, the one who is most pious. And that's where you and I begin to realize that there's a greater goal to the differences that we find within our environments and societies and mankind. It's that we learn from one another, not that we begin to create stereotypes from one another, not that one begins to have a hand above the other, number one. And number two, when we compete, we don't compete in material values. We don't compete in material assets. We compete in which one of us can be closer to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala.
I completely, again, I understand, and theoretically, I'm trying to look at this from a very practical, real-life kind of perspective. The idea of stereotypes. Sometimes, it's just natural. People will argue that it's just natural. You see a certain community or a certain group of people who, for whatever reason, do not make the most out of the potential that they have, for example. For whatever reason, they, for example, choose not to, seize their opportunities, seize the potential, and they are happy to be, achieve less, to have lower ambition, for example. And then it's just almost natural that you think, hold on, I'm glad that I come from where I come from, or I'm part of this community, or I'm apart from this nation or whatever, and these people are underachievers. You feel a sense of pride, or not necessarily pride, but you think and you see and you realize that, hold on, we have so little yet we have achieved so much. They have so much potential, but they waste it away. That kind of natural kind of stereotype that we often form. People argue it's so natural because they themselves have allowed themselves not to achieve. How detrimental is that? And how do we insulate ourselves from that?
It's always going to be detrimental when we see ourselves greater than other people. We don't know who's closer. Remember, the aim is who's closer in the eyes of Allah. Not which one of us are greater achievers when it comes to the kind of salaries that we get or the job positions that we get. Number one. Number two, I agree that there are certain types of people who you may spend quite a lot of time with and then realize that this person doesn't have a drive to better themselves. It's not that they don't have the opportunities. Opportunities are out there for them to obtain, but they just don't have the drive and the will. They prefer to be lazy, lethargic and just continue in the manner that they are. When we see those types of people, I feel we have to look at it in two lenses. One is be very grateful for what we have then. So then we're grateful for where we are today, what our parents, our communities have done for us today. It brings about a great deal of humbleness before Allah. Secondly, I feel we have a duty then to see if we can assist those people. It's not about becoming better than them. It doesn't do anything to me. If I feel I'm better than that group of people because they're underachieving, it does no good to me. But if I'm thankful for what I have, that's done good to me, number one. And if I see that I have a responsibility now to those people, again, that's done good to me as well. If I have wealth, that group doesn't, or that person doesn't, I might remember and recall that there was a time when I didn't have wealth. It didn't just come to me, I had to struggle for it, or somebody helped me along the way. Then maybe it's now my turn to return that act of goodness and help somebody else as well. If we have that type of mentality, instead of trying to build these superficial class systems within ourselves, that's when we find that society, a family, a community can begin to progress.
Ahsan, thank you very much for that. One of the points that is often mentioned is the idea of race and lineage. You'll find this, these kind of terms often being used where people show pride of their lineage, for example, or of their race. This kind of merges with the previous point, but not necessarily stereotypes. Sometimes people just have a pride for the fact that they come from a certain place. It's like an inbuilt thing. Or for example, the fact that they come from a certain family. Maybe they have people within their family and they have a lineage from them who have achieved things in the past, and now they feel that that is a source of pride for them. I think on the surface, all those people, everyone, ourselves included, know that it's wrong. Like we've mentioned, a lot of these things, theoretically, they seem correct. But often we find that we can take pride in these things, subconsciously almost. What are your thoughts on, lineage and taking pride in race and these kind of things?
There's a tradition from the Prophet in which he says that the bane of good lineage is pride. So that which will spoil good lineage, or that which is detrimental to a good lineage, is pride. It's very easy to become proud of your lineage, your ancestors, their accomplishments. Again, instead of looking at it from the lens that we should be proud of it, we should be grateful. We should learn from it. By me being proud of what people have accomplished before me and boasting about it to other people, it does nothing to me. And that's why somebody who has pride is so hollow inside. Because they only achieve a superficial status in the eyes of people for a few moments. When they're boasting, people look up to them. But as soon as they stop, everyone goes back to their life. They realize that in actual fact, I was only satisfied for a few moments. So again, they go to their next action. And every act that they do, they'll exaggerate. Every act that they do, they'll try and make sure that people find out about it instead of it being done in private. About race, we find that sometimes we're taught a good lesson. When you go, or even nationality. You look at nationality, for example. When you go from England to another country, there's some countries that will look up to you as being British, and they'll give you extra respect because of the fact that you come from a particular country, or even your accent is immaculate compared to theirs. And then you'll go to another country that will look down upon you because they'll look up at their own people and they'll see no value in you. And so God is teaching you, even if you travel the earth, you'll find that your race, your nationality means nothing. In one place you're respected, in the other place you're disrespected. The only thing that will hold you high in the eyes of people is when you yourself are a man who is moral. Would you prefer to hold high in your eyes and have your children look up to somebody who is immoral but has money, or somebody who is moral but doesn't have money? At the end of the day, it comes down to principle. And I feel that if we don't work for people, and this is proven in a hadith as well, that when you don't work for people, they'll come to you. If your aim is not people, they'll respect you. The Imams ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in dua that to lower myself with the same amount that you've increased my perception in the eyes of people, to make sure that I never see myself as something great. I only want to see you as great and I want to see my goal as perfecting myself in my closeness to you. It's strange that we run after these superficial values, and at the end of the day we're never satisfied. As much fame as we have, we want more. It shows us that there's no goal to this, and you'll never be satisfied with it.
You know, this idea of pride, or this takabbur, if you like, this manifestation of pride, people acting in that haughty kind of way. People often say that this is actually a mask. So they have various insecurities, for example, or they may not even be conscious, they could be subconscious insecurities. But they behave in a way, especially amongst other people, in a way that is boastful or loud or chauvinistic, to kind of hide the fact that they have these insecurities. It could be in private that they're very conscious about these things, but in public they behave in this most, like a grand kind of way to kind of hide these things, or they're short with people, or they're boastful or arrogant, or rude in the way they speak, behaving in a way that they try to depict themselves in a way that is not necessarily what they actually are, ultimately hiding certain insecurities. Do you think that is always the case, or do you think that is...
When you look at the reason why anyone is proud, it's definitely because of the fact that they have some sort of vacuum within themselves. They find a hole within that they need to fill, and they believe that can only be filled by the praise of people. If somebody's content with who they are, content with their actions, satisfied that they've tried their best, it doesn't make a difference as to what people's opinions are. My act does not become greater if people praise it. Neither is it devalued if people do not pay attention or heed to it. It shows insecurity in this person. It shows that they don't realize who they're acting for, and that they should be acting for something much greater than what's in the eyes of people. Today people will be with you, tomorrow they'll be against you. We've seen it in society, that if you have wealth, people want to know you. When you've lost your wealth, people don't want to know you. People run after you because they want something from you. Fame comes to you because people want something from you. And as soon as you've lost that, when they realize you can't give it to them, then they run away from you. But if we're working for a greater goal, like the pleasure of Allah, then it doesn't matter what people say. And you'll find this in all of the Imams' lives. How many people turn their backs on them? How many people ridicule them? Even the Prophet, when Islam was being spread initially, the difficulties he had to go through. If he was working for the eyes of people, we wouldn't have a religion today. If he was working based on the comments of people and for the fame in the eyes of the people, the mission would have stopped a long time ago. But the drive that kept him going was the greater goal, that it's the pleasure of Allah in each step that I take. So definitely there is great insecurity in these individuals who have any form of pride.
So would you tie this insecurity again? It seems like every show we return back to this point, the idea that it comes back to just a misunderstanding or a lack of knowledge of the Creator and of our role within this whole ontology, if you like. The fact that you're insecure about something. Say for example you're insecure about something, it's because maybe you haven't accepted that, hold on, this is what God has chosen for you. If you accept that and you have your head around that fact that God has chosen this path for me, or chosen these characteristics, or this lineage, nationality, etc., etc., and you're comfortable with that, then ultimately you're not insecure. But the insecurities come from the fact that you think or you feel things were different maybe. And again, that comes back to the idea that you think maybe things, or God has made a wrong decision, or you haven't even equated God in the equation. So ultimately it comes back to this idea of ma'rifah, if you like. Moving on, various discussions, again looking at the struggle within and looking at previous shows. One of the points that we often look at is when you embark on this greater struggle or this greater jihad, it is very, and this could be in various other avenues as well, especially to do with worship and your relationship with the religion, with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When you find that you're progressing, and for example you're working hard and you're self-reflecting and you're trying to get rid of the vices that you have within you, and you're embarking on this greater struggle, and you feel that you are progressing, you feel like you're making some headway, you're making some understanding, you're getting your head around the fact that, oh, okay, God has chosen certain paths for me, or etc., etc., and you feel that you're making some headway, and then ultimately you become, or you fall into this pitfall of becoming not necessarily proud, but you feel like you've achieved something, and you feel that maybe others have not achieved what you have achieved. Again, it seems like there's some level of pride attached into that, and it seems you've almost fallen into the first pitfall of this path, if you like.
One has to be continuously overlooking themselves in every act that they do. And if their intention is sincere, then they won't fall into this pitfall. It's not only whilst doing the action, but even after the action has been completed. You'll find that if somebody does an act in secrecy, if they have that desire for people to know about it, then again they'll fall into the same pitfall. They'll initially, if they complete an act in secrecy, they'll feel accomplished. They'll feel that they've been able to do something, but they'll be grateful to Allah for having given them the ability to do it. When they see within themselves, then in actual fact, it's not enough that only God saw this action. I want to inform others about it. That's when these pitfalls begin to emerge again. We have to realize that this religion is a way of life. I can't pick and choose. If I'm going to accept the religion, I need to accept it wholeheartedly. Yes, contextualization of law, implementation of law is a different topic altogether. But when it comes to principles of morality, these don't change. These remain intact for the entirety, for the entire creation, for the whole of mankind, from the beginning to the end. So if one realizes the principles and realizes why God has placed these principles, then naturally they won't divert and fall into these pitfalls that you have been mentioning.
You mentioned here the idea that, if they get to the point where they feel they want to share this and they want to tell people that, okay, I did this, for example, or I've achieved this, but sometimes the pride just may just be an internal thing. For example, maybe you, and we've mentioned this in previous shows, the idea that maybe, for example, you're in a group of people, and for example, and you feel that they are inclined, or they are preoccupied in something so worldly. For example, maybe it could be the football. You feel that they are so preoccupied in this, they're so passionate about this, and you think to yourself, I'm not like this. And you feel that within you, that you have achieved something, that you are beyond these mundane things, and you feel you have gone somewhere. So you don't necessarily communicate that. It's just something internal, and you feel that maybe you're better than them. And this could be in anything. It could be, for example, someone may say, I've never prayed Salatul Layl, for example, and they're okay with it. And you feel, I pray every day. And it comes within that, hold on, I've achieved something. And it seems like it could be something so quick. It could happen so, without even knowing maybe, where you feel and you think to yourself that, I give charity. These guys, maybe they don't, or whatever it is. But just that being self-satisfied almost, and having that pride within yourself, not sharing it. Maybe the fact that you don't share it, and you have pride in the fact that you don't share it. That, I don't need to share it with anyone. That's how great I am, kind of thing. Or I'm beyond that I don't need to share it with these guys. They're not important enough. That kind of element. How do we insulate ourselves from that?
This tradition that talks about how pride is like a black ant crawling on a dark stone in the midst of the night. It's very difficult to realize when pride has crept in, because even an action can begin sincerely, but eventually by the end of it, it can divert. I give the example normally of recitation in public. If you're reciting a dua or something in public, you've been practicing, especially when you're young and you practice, let's say, some sort of melody or tune to recite the dua in. Halfway through the recitation, you lose the tune. You began sincerely. You were doing it solely for the sake of God initially. But as it went on, you lost that tune. Now you begin to think to yourself that, what was the tune? What will people think? If I'm not in tune, people won't enjoy it. And now all of a sudden the whole dua changes and the recitation changes from being for God, now being for people. But we have to be vigilant over ourselves. There's nobody who knows you and I better than ourselves. If I know that reciting in public, for example, is detrimental to me or harmful, it's easy that I can sin and fall into pride, then I need to stay away from it. If I know that wearing a particular dress or watch or driving a certain car is easily going to allow me to fall into sin, the sin of pride, then naturally I need to stay away from this. It's very difficult initially to observe pride, but we'll understand it when it comes. As for the mentioning you had about individuals who feel self-satisfied within themselves, I believe that even that type of pride will eventually lead to them wanting to make it known. If I'm not going to indulge in this football game like everybody else, I'll make a statement for them to know that I'm above them. I'll walk out of the room. I won't speak to them about it. If I've given charity and I see that people aren't giving as much charity, I'll mention it to someone somewhere, even if it's a family member. You find individuals who donate certain amounts of charity and then wish to have their name put on a mosque, for example, or a certain hall named after them. You begin to question, what is the need? Why in the first place do our mosques allow this and our communities allow it? It's just facilitating for people and encouraging people to be proud in what act they've been doing instead of hiding it for the sake of God. So I think it's present and pride creeps in very easily, but if we know ourselves well, then we can be vigilant of it.
Maybe this reminds you, maybe it comes down to the company as well. So say, for example, you feel when you are, again in this scenario, if we stick with this scenario, for example, the group of people you're with are so preoccupied with this mundane football game, for example, and you feel, this is lowly. You don't say anything necessarily, but when you're with other company, maybe people who you respect, or people who you feel have achieved maybe within this path that you are trying to also achieve in, and then you may mention it to them that, how mundane are these people that they are so preoccupied with this worldly thing. So it's almost as if you're trying to now boast to this person that you look up to. So you look down on these people and you feel you're better than them, but you see a person whom you respect, and you will then try and elevate your status in the eyes of this person ultimately. So again, it can work in so many various different scenarios. The question that I have now, is there anything we can be proud of? Can we be proud of any achievement? Is there anything where we can feel that, okay, we've achieved something?
Like I said at the beginning, there is that positive energy and satisfaction that needs to be there. It's our driving force. When I've accomplished something and I'm placing my goals and my targets even higher, and I'm working towards it, and when I look at what I've accomplished, I should feel satisfaction, but gratitude should be there firstly. If I'm grateful, as soon as I look at my accomplishments, I'm not proud of it in the sense that look what I've done, but I'm so grateful that I've been given the opportunity and the ability to do it, and I hope and I pray that I can even accomplish the tasks that I've set forth for myself. That's not pride in a negative manner. That's pride which is positive. That's self-confidence. That's courage, and that's that driving force that needs to be there within us in order for us to excel and be at the top of our game in everything and anything we do.
When we look at pride, again, this was, as you mentioned in previous shows, we often look at this discussion at how we ourselves have that introspective relationship within ourselves to look at, do we have this pride, or do we have this belief that we may be superior to others? But ultimately, how is a person who displays this level of pride, how are they perceived? How is it natural? What is the common way that such people are perceived by people? what effect does it have on family, on society, when you have people who have this tendency within them to look down at others, or to look within themselves and feel that they have achieved more or are better than others in that sense? What does that achieve, and what does that then spread within society?
It definitely breaks up close friendship ties, because nobody wants to be a companion of somebody who's continuously boasting about themselves, looking down at others. If today two friends can, from these two friends, one can look down at others, the other friend may think that, well, he can do that to me tomorrow. If I backbite about other people to you, you'll think that when you go away, I'll end up backbiting you as well. So there'll be a lack of trust. Nobody will want to be a companion of this individual. For family, again, you don't share much with these people. You want to give them as little information as possible, because you know that one day they can use it against you as well. So their reputation will also obviously be tarnished in society. They'll have very little companionship, no trust in society. But these things can be changed. If individuals work on themselves, they'll be able to change it. The greatest detriment is if somebody doesn't change themselves, what happens in the hereafter as well. Two traditions from the Prophet that make clear to us the eventual end of somebody who dies whilst having this vice of pride that they've not tried to work against. The first is when the Prophet says, on the Day of Judgment, the angel who's assigned to bring the deeds of man comes forth. As he's rising, even the angel becomes pleased with what he's carrying. The man obviously or the woman becomes pleased as well by seeing this great mass of good deeds. And then Allah commands the angels to go and throw these good deeds into Sijjin, the lowest pit in hell, because of the fact that this individual didn't do any of these good actions for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. You can imagine, after working in this life, striving for perfection, adhering to the rules and regulations and boundaries of our religion, moral principles, after 70, 80, 90 years, we find that we have nothing in the end. We sacrificed 90 years of our life. We stayed within these boundaries. But at the end of the day, we have nothing. Simply because of the fact that I was doing it for myself and for other people, and not sincerely for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In the second tradition, the Prophet says that the hellfire and its inmates rage on account of the people of pride when they're put into hell. Then the man asks the Prophet, how is this possible? What happens? And the Prophet says that the hellfire rages because of the intense heat that it has when these individuals come into it. You can see the punishment that may take place to individuals who die with this sin and who haven't tried to remove this vice from themselves. The effects are in this life and the next as well.
A final point that we now want to look at, but before we do, this reminds me of, ultimately the story of Iblis. It's clear as we read in the Quran that he worshipped, and we have in the Hadith, he worshipped for 6,000 years. And then we don't know whether they were years in terms of how we count or etc. And ultimately it was one instance of pride where he said that I'm made out of fire and he's made out of clay. 6,000 years, imagine, and we have 60, 70, 90, whatever. So after 6,000 of years, he had one instance of showing pride, and that was enough to banish him. Whereas we have however many years, and we may find that we display pride on so many different scenarios, so many different times within our lives. I don't know, I think it's quite telling. Finally, before we end the show, how do we ultimately recognize this within ourselves, and how do we combat this? Is it as simply as trying to maintain that idea of looking within constantly? But ultimately, what is the root in terms of trying to protect and insulate ourselves from this?
It has to be that man has to know himself. We can't continue to lead a life where we're always looking in the future. We're always thinking of what I can do next. What will people think about me? How should I present? It's all about looking in the future, and nobody tends to emphasize on looking at who I am and this moment in time, what I'm doing at this moment in time, how I can better myself at this moment in time. When we realize who we are, realize what's inside us, and it doesn't take long. We know what works for us and what doesn't. We know when this God-given gift, this primordial nature or the fitrah that we have, we know when it's in divine communication, when it's helping us, when it's guiding us through divine assistance of Allah. We know when our guilty conscience, or this nafs lawama, is speaking, is biting us. But we have to begin to listen to it. We have to begin to listen to this guidance or the signs of Allah that is placing around us. The more we give a blind eye to these signs, the lesser this voice becomes, the softer it becomes. Finally, it's silenced totally, and we'll have no conscience to work against. If we work, like you were saying, internally, realize what works for me and what doesn't. The examples I gave, if I know that I wear a particular type of dress or cloth, or if it's going to bring about pride, if I'm going to be anxious and waiting for the next remark from individuals, then I know I need to stay away from it. You'll get some people who do the opposite. They'll dress to impress, they'll want the comments, they'll drive a particular car to get the stares and the looks. We have to work against it practically. And when you begin to work against it, you realize that you're holding yourself back. Your soul wants it. Your desire wants somebody to say something good to you, but you're holding back. That's where you begin to restrain yourself. That's where you're beginning to learn who you really are, what your shortfalls are, what your weaknesses are, and how to work against them. Finally, it has to be done with supplication. You and I, as much as we try, we will fall short of our aims. We can never become perfect. So we have to supplicate to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and beseech Him to complete this action for me. I'm going to try my best to remove pride from me. But a true supplication, something that I really desire and I want, and I'll show God that I want it through my action. And in return, I want from Him that He completes it for me. These two, the dua and the action, dua and amal, come hand in hand. If they come together naturally, why would Allah want to give somebody who's getting closer to Him and wanting to come closer to Him, why would Allah want to give him something that's evil or detrimental for him? He would only want to give what's good. If we're trying to get closer to Him, He's only going to help us as well.
Hassan, thank you very much for that. We've reached the end of our show this week. I want to thank you once again for taking the time out. Thank you for watching at home. Join us again next week on The Struggle Within. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Ahlul Bayt TV, the holy household for every household.